Witam bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym spotkaniu. Dziś naszym gościem będzie pani profesor Janine Wedel, amerykańska antropolog, profesor uniwersytecki w Schar School of Policy and Government na George Mason University w Wirginii. Naczelnym tematem badań pani profesor są wpływy elit politycznych, układy nieformalne, korupcja, wszystko to w ujęciu antropologii społecznej. Pani profesor jest autorką licznych publikacji, opracowań, współpracuje z licznymi uczelniami wyższymi, zarówno w Stanach Zjednoczonych, jak i w Europie, oraz mediami. Często występuje jako ekspert w odniesieniu do badanych przez siebie dziedzin. Jest dziś z nami również pan Adam Śmiech, pracownik Biblioteki Uniwersyteckiej Uniwersytetu Łódzkiego, który pomagał nam będzie we wzajemnej komunikacji. Nasze spotkanie będzie dotyczyło pierwszej publikacji pani profesor. Jest to książka wydana pierwotnie w 1986 roku w Stanach Zjednoczonych, natomiast polskie wydanie, które właśnie Państwu prezentuję, zatytułowane Prywatna Polska, po angielsku The Private Poland, ukazało się nakładem wydawnictwa Trio w roku 2007. Książka bardzo interesująca, stanowi ona w zasadzie zbiór przemyśleń, zbiór obserwacji na temat Polski w dobie stanu wojennego. Pani profesor przyjechała tu do Polski jeszcze jako studentka socjologii w latach 80., dokładnie w latach 1982-1984 i właśnie opisała tą naszą ówczesną rzeczywistość. Popełniła tą pracę, która pierwotnie miała dotyczyć no nieco innych spraw, ale akurat te wszystkie obserwacje, spostrzeżenia doprowadziły do właśnie ukazania się tej książki. I właśnie może przechodząc bezpośrednio już do tematu naszego spotkania, po raz pierwszy odwiedziła pani nasz kraj w roku 1977. Podczas kolejnej wizyty, o czym mówiłem, w roku 1982 w Polsce wprowadzony był już stan wojenny. Pierwotnie planowała pani napisać książkę o Solidarności, o tym fenomenie ruchu politycznego, ruchu społecznego. Ostatecznie jednak w wyniku licznych studiów, rozmów, obserwacji powstała praca ilustrująca właśnie ówczesne realia społeczno-polityczne, która niejednokrotnie w mojej ocenie wykracza poza ramy klasycznej pracy naukowej. Można tam dostrzec na przykład jakieś wątki takie reportażowe, pracy spoza właśnie tego kręgu naukowego. Ukazywane w niej spojrzenie oczami cudzoziemca cenne jest nie tylko dla zachodniego czytelnika, do którego siłą rzeczy było skierowane, ale też dla Polaków. Pozwala nam bowiem spojrzeć na siebie, spojrzeć na własną historię z nieco innej perspektywy. I właśnie, jakie pani wyniosła wrażenia, jakie doświadczenia, jakie przeżycia z Polski tego no, dramatycznego przecież czasu, który obfitował w szereg wydarzeń?
Ja zrozumiałam. I understood. Dziękuję bardzo za zaproszenie. Jestem zaszczycona możliwością rozmowy z panem. Jak pan mówił, ja mieszkałam około 6 lat w Polsce w latach 80. To było bardzo interesujący okres dla mnie, młodego antropologa społecznego, kiedy mogłam uczestniczyć w codziennym życiu Polaków, i prowadzić badanie do mojej pracy doktorskiej. So what do I remember from those times? Well, if we start with martial law Poland, I was at that time a PhD student. This was December of 1981, of course, and I was a PhD student at the University of California at Berkeley. And I lived in an international house for graduate students and visiting scholars. And I had a Fulbright to go to Poland when martial law was declared on December 13th. And I knew people in this house where I lived. There were 5 or 6 visiting scholars from Poland who were stranded there and were terrified and very upset, of course, about the introduction of martial law. I actually had a Fulbright fellowship. I was planning to come to Poland, and I was close friend. I had the Fulbright in hand. I was close friends with, a handful of wonderful visiting scholars from Poland. And so it was a real shock for me as well. And I feel like I lived through that experience with them. It wasn't clear that I was going to be able to come to Poland after the declaration of martial law and take up my fellowship. However, as it turned out, martial law was, of course, it was a terrible event for Poles, a whole series of repressions and closed borders and so on. But General Jaruzelski also wanted to maintain, apparently, some relations and with the wider Western world, and he was honoring Fulbright fellowships. So in February, mid-February of that year, the next year, so 6 weeks later, I was actually able, in 1982, to come to Poland. Picture the scene. The word gets out among the visiting scholars and their networks, the Polish visiting scholars in the United States and their networks, that someone is going to Poland and that an American is going and can take messages from them and money from them to their families. Also understand that the information that was coming out in the press and on television in Poland was such, that is in the United States and in the West, showed the empty shelves in the stores, that you could not buy anything in the stores. And so I took that to heart. And when I got ready to come, or when I went to Poland, traveled to Poland, I came with 11, count them, 11 boxes of goods, canned goods, all kinds of things, supplies that I and other people might need. So that is the situation that I came with. And I remember changing planes in the airport in Amsterdam. It was a KLM flight from New York to Warsaw via Amsterdam. And I remember sitting on that plane and memorizing messages from, I don't know, a couple dozen, probably 20 some Poles that I was then going to take to their families from them, because communications were very, very difficult and everything was censored and so on. So that was that one image that I have. And then I arrive in Poland with these 11 boxes. I arrived in Warsaw and was taken to an apartment where I was going to rent a room from a woman and her adult daughter. And when I arrived, I came with all these boxes, and I remember the kind of the surprise expression that they had. And then there was the issue of you know, delivering these messages to all these people, and they weren't just in Warsaw, but they were also throughout Poland. So some of the relatives of the scholars that I knew and their acquaintances came to Warsaw to see me. And what happened? In the West, there was all this information about nothing on the shelves, but when I went to, of course, everyone invited me over. People were extremely hospitable. They brought out meat and fish, and I had to eat. Yes, yes, yes. And of course, very friendly, and I gained many kilos during those first 3 months, just in the course of delivering these messages. That was kind of my first lesson about. I was young. I was, you know, doctoral student, but I was maybe 23 years old, and it was my my first intense experience or longer term experience in a situation of scarcity in a communist country. And so this was the first puzzle in Poland that I was confronted with. How can it be that the shelves are empty, or at least not full, and at the same time, people seem to have, or most people seem to have, enough to eat. Not that they had what they wanted, not that they had luxury goods, but people weren't starving. And I watched my landlady, to whom I became very close. In fact, I called her Mama after we became close, and so on. And she was very skilled in the Polish culture of survival and resilience in this sophisticated informal system. And I watched her at Halemirowska, the market next door, and I watched all her wheeling and dealing very effectively with the clerks who loved her, to get milk, eggs, bread, meat, basically what she had. She was an expert in these kinds of political, social skills, which were the specialty of the informal system, of informal economic system in Poland. My first clues were certain terms, certain words that were simply non-translatable into English, like załatwić sprawę, kombinować, organizować, right? These are terms for which that were used on a daily basis, but for which there is no good English equivalent. And I suggest that you use the original terms when Mr. Pan Adam, when you're translating, because there are no good translations. But if you say that, you know, mam sprawę do załatwienia, it means that you don't have to be very specific. It could be something. It's something that you have to do, that may have to do with informal relations, informal economy, but you're not actually giving any details. And so what I discovered through the exploration of these kinds of terms, like załatwić sprawę, was this whole informal but very sophisticated system with its own informal rules and, of course, important networks that in order to survive, everyone had these networks that were crucial to their ability to operate in daily life. And so what was the world that I studied? So when we think about martial law Poland, we think about curfew, we think about checks. I mean, remember the guards, the militia who were stationed around the city that would come up to people and ask, that would come up to you and ask for your identification card. We remember Rozmowa kontrolowana. We remember these are the images from martial law. We remember people who were internowana, arestowani, and so on. But what we don't, and that's all true. But what is also true was that this other system, this pervasive, this way of life was also a crucial part of the reality. This sophisticated system of survival, of networks, and of creating workarounds. And of course, this informal system also was very much interconnected with the way the formal system operated. So the two were very much intertwined, and that was a key source of absolute fascination for me. But day after day, I saw people handling situations in which the only recourse is your own resourcefulness. And so it's not, I saw that not only in the economic sphere, the importance of these informal ways of doing things, these workarounds, and the importance of networks in terms of securing goods and resources. But I also saw this in the political sphere. For example, the apartment that I lived in was searched. Very early in the morning, there's a knock at the door with 4 militia, most in, well, a couple of them in plain clothes, some of them in uniform. I'm not the target of that. That turns out the daughter of my landlady is the target of that. But I began to understand that, the terror that one could experience. But in the case of this particular household, I also saw that the interconnections across polarized lines. And so that while the opposition or in solidarity on the one hand and Communist Party on the other were presented as very polar opposites, and of course ideologically they were, I also saw the ability to work across lines and between lines, and I saw how these two women handled this extremely difficult and very trying situation for them. And to me, that is a resource that that Poles have developed over the this is not just, of course, about the martial law, the difficult martial law period in Poland. It's also about Polish history and the cultural skills, this sophisticated system that has developed over the years when Poland was obviously through occupation, through the period of the partitions, and then of course the Nazi occupation and then communist domination and so on. So yes, so I think those are some of the important lessons that I learned, and that I would also want younger people, people who were born after the afterwards, who are young adults now or younger, I would want them to understand and see these things about the history of their own societies and of their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And I want to emphasize that these repressions are real. I am not saying that the repressions, the occupation, martial law wasn't terrible. Terrible things happened during that period, absolutely. But I also want to say that under these circumstances, and which I observed how people developed skills, however difficult, that became part of a kind of informal way of doing things that enabled them to work with close friends, to work with relatives, to be able to solve problems in the face of terrible adversity. And so what I observed during those years was a complex and ingenious society, which was quite different from the communist police state that was known in that was portrayed in the West. And again, I'm not saying that the police state wasn't real. It absolutely was, and it had terrible consequences. But there was also this important, complex, ingenious society alongside it and interacting with it, which I think is very important for people to understand. This is part of a Polish legacy, and I think it's one that Poles have absolute reason to be proud of. Saying these things, I'll just say one more thing, which is that I'm not sure. I don't want to romanticize this informal system, but I spent years trying to describe it, to show how it was a systematic way of operating in which people operated, and how it was effective. There's one other term that I want to introduce that the Polish sociologist Adam Podgorecki talked about. He talked about dirty togetherness, and that was about the networks that people used to help them survive and sometimes even thrive, and that's also an important part of the legacy.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because very simply, sometimes the rules had to be skirted, and sometimes there was this sense of shame in skirting the rules. There was a sense, as I wrote in Prywatna Polska, there was a sense of both pride in accomplishing something. For instance, if I want to make a deal, and I talk in Private Poland about managing to załatwić some beautiful leather bags that weren't available if you just came in the store, only available if you made some deals with the clerk and paid her a tip and perked her, and the sense that you feel of the people felt on the one hand proud of being able, oh, I managed it, I did it. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there was also this sense of shame. This sense that, well, okay, but that means somebody else didn't get it. The sense of perhaps breaking the rules, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So it was a mixed, I think, with mixed emotions that people were involved. And I think the dirty togetherness expression that Adam Podgorecki coined also begins to convey it. But pride and shame, they worked together in my experience.
Praca niejednokrotnie przełamuje takie właśnie stereotypy, jakie panują na temat ówczesnych realiów. Lata 80. w Pani książce jawią się jako pewne swoiste przeżycie wspólnotowe, gdzie właśnie podział na władze komunistyczne i opozycyjne społeczeństwo jest to, o czym Pani wspominała, właśnie umowny, nieostry. Pozwolę tu sobie na pewien osobisty wtręt. Otóż wspominany przez Panią w książce Prywatna Polska profesor Czesław Pilichowski, dyrektor ówczesny Głównej Komisji Badania Zbrodni Hitlerowskich w Polsce, był wieloletnim przełożonym mojego dziadka, który był dyrektorem archiwum tej komisji. I właśnie w osobie wspominanego przez Panią profesora Pilichowskiego bardzo dobrze zilustrowany jest, opisywany przez Panią dualizm postaw Polaków. Otóż profesor Pilichowski w czasie wojny należał do Armii Krajowej, był członkiem Narodowej Organizacji Ojczyzna, która współtworzyła polskie państwo podziemne, zaś po roku 1945, już po wojnie, był nadal aktywny na polu działalności społeczno-politycznej, potem nawet wstąpił do PZPR. Podobne biografie i realia dotyczące opisywanych przez Panią w pracy warunków życia w Polsce lat 80. znamy w kraju z autopsji. Jeżeli sami, my uczestniczący w spotkaniu byliśmy zbyt młodzi, aby to widzieć i pamiętać, to wiemy chociażby z relacji naszych rodziców, dziadków, pradziadków, znajomych. Ale myślę, że te wszystkie obserwacje były dla wielu czytelników Pani książki na Zachodzie czymś bardzo niezrozumiałym. I tu mam właśnie pytanie o odbiór Pani pracy właśnie na Zachodzie, jak ona była odebrana.
I think I understood. So yes, absolutely. I think my book did break these black and white stereotypes precisely because I described this very real and resilient informal system of ways of doing things and networks. And that wasn't the story that people were hearing. They were hearing about empty shelves. They were hearing about political repression. I wasn't saying, of course, that wasn't true. Of course, it was true. But rather, I was showing how political repression and empty shelves interacted with these Polish ways of doing things. So yes, it did break the stereotypes, and actually the reception was surprisingly perhaps positive. The Private Poland was reviewed in all kinds of venues, from the Los Angeles Times to Osteuropa Wirtschaft, East European Economy, and German publication. That's an example of a smaller academic publication, to Chicago Tribune. I mean, it was widely and positively reviewed, and mostly by people. The reviewers were, fortunately for me, were people who had some experience with Poland, in some cases a lot of experience with Poland, so they understood that this was a true story, but it was a story under a story. It wasn't the story that either it wasn't the key story that, let's say, that Solidarity leaders would want to get out, or Communist Party on the other hand. It was a story that didn't fit into that the standard narratives. I think what was important here, or what might be important here as a kind of lesson, is that there's this polarization, tremendous polarization of society on the surface of things, and more than on the surface, the ideological polarization, which is real and has consequences, and shapes who we invite to the dinner table and who we don't invite to the dinner table, and so on. And that is all, and that's all extremely important. What is also the case, though, is that we have to, or a lesson from that, I should say more clearly, is that we have to look underneath the surface of how the society is actually operating in practice. What are the actual workings of the system? And what are in more academic terms, sort of what are the networks, the horizontal networks, both with among regular people and then also in the hierarchy. We have to look more closely at what's really going on in society, and what are the practices? What are these kinds of informal practices? And I think that's a real lesson here.
Ostatni rozdział Pani pracy zatytułowany jest Rzut oka w przyszłość. Rozmówcy, z którymi przeprowadzała Pani wywiady, pytani o swoje przewidywania na najbliższe 40 lat, roztaczali dość pesymistyczne wizje. Obchodzimy właśnie 40. rocznicę wprowadzenia stanu wojennego w Polsce. Jak z tej perspektywy ocenia Pani okres, który nastąpił po tych wydarzeniach? Można powiedzieć, że całe szczęście większość z tych pesymistycznych, a niekiedy wręcz apokaliptycznych przewidywań nie sprawdziła się.
Okay, so a couple of things that I would say. The first has to do with the very resilient networks in which people organized themselves during the night, certainly earlier, but as I observed in the 1980s. So the resilience of these networks, and what I saw going on in Poland in the late 80s, this is a few years after the publication of Prywatna Polska. What I saw was these almost clandestine or subterranean elite networks almost coming out of the woodwork. And these were networks that had a lot of different, that played a lot of different roles. You know, they might be involved in environmental cleanup. They might be involved in lobbying for fewer business restrictions. This is still under communism, of course. But as things as glasnost and perestroika were emanating from the Soviet Union, I saw things in the late 80s loosening up. And so the networks that I had written about earlier, I saw how they became important in shaping the system that was emerging even before communism was formally finished. And so I think a lesson in all of this is the way in which informal networks, elite networks in this case, have worked to shape the Polish formal system of politics and economics. I think that's a very important issue. I don't think in terms of pessimism or optimism, actually. I think really in terms of trying to understand the system and how it works. So that's one important crucial legacy, I think, in terms of understanding what has happened in Poland since the 1980s, when I was on the ground for large chunks of time there. I would just add to that very briefly on this theme that these informal networks sometimes played quite a positive role, and sometimes they played more of a negative role and facilitated various kinds of corruption and patterns of resource distribution that perhaps weren't in the interest of a wider group of Polish citizens. But one thing, so the informal networks and how they and their role in shaping the Polish the economic and political system that developed is one important legacy. Another one that I think did not survive in the way that I had seen in Poland, another legacy or another kind of Polish institution, if I can say that, is what I call in Prywatna Polska życie duchowe, which life of the spirit, which again is one of those terms that is really not translatable into English. It means life. It means at the same time it means intellectual, emotional, philosophical. It's everything about the spirit, and it's about one's intellectual and really kind of spiritual life in a community. It has that community connotation. And this was common. This was a way of life during a time when people did have time, when they would when what they had was friends and close friends and family. And that's who they trusted. That's who they relied upon. And so people would get together in their homes and have, hours long conversations about things that were important in life. And I think that institution of life of the spirit, of duchowa life, has taken a real hit with the imposition of the market, because people simply don't have time, and relationships with the institution of the market become less important. We don't need them as much. Now that's I think a change. So when I think about it, think back on those years in the 80s when I spent so much of my 20s in Poland, all those years in Poland, and I think, well, why did I do that? And certainly one of the key reasons was because of these relationships. This życie duchowe was so interesting, so compelling, and one learned and benefited in so many ways from it. And the trust and the relationships that people developed were so special under those circumstances. And I want to say just one more thing about trust, because I think this goes to right to Pan Maciej's comment, question about the future. And of course, one of the strengths of Polish society during that period was the trusting relationships within the środowisko społeczne, just a small social circle of family and friends. It didn't go wider than that. And that was a strength. Now, people invested and people believed and trusted in their own nasi, tak, but not in the other, and certainly not in formal institutions and of the state, or really formal, except for the church, formal institutions they did not trust in at all. And that is a trend that we are now seeing all over the world that we have now seen in the past 3 to 4 decades, not just in, well, Eastern Europe, but absolutely in Western Europe and elsewhere. I can say that in the United States, trust in formal organizations, whether it's government, parliament, institutions of government, parliament, presidencies on the one hand, or whether it's business banks on the other, or even religious organizations, that trust has plummeted. It has really declined substantially. And this has created really a problem a problem for society, a problem for democracy. And it is absolutely interacts with the polarization of society that we see now, not only in Poland, but certainly in the United States and elsewhere. And so it seems to me that as we now trust in our own, one of the challenges here for societies, not just in Poland, but certainly in the United States, is to work towards mechanisms to find ways of trusting in institutions and creating institutions that we can trust, that are responsive to publics, and that we can that we can trust. And this is one of the big challenges for societies around the world.
Dziękuję bardzo Pani Profesor za to, że przyjęła nasze zaproszenie. Mam nadzieję, że jeszcze być może w najbliższym czasie, być może trochę później odwiedzi Pani nasz kraj. Serdecznie zapraszamy. Proszę pamiętać też o Bibliotece na Koszykowej, która przecież jest instytucją przede wszystkim życia duchowego i gdzie staramy się te wartości pielęgnować. Dziękuję też koledze Adamowi za bardzo dokładne, rzetelne tłumaczenie. Państwu dziękuję zaś za uwagę i zapraszam do śledzenia naszych innych materiałów zamieszczanych na kanale YouTube Biblioteki. Dziękuję bardzo.